Hey everybody, we're live here. My name is Philip Martin, and I am the owner, co-owner of Philip Martin Gallery here in Los Angeles, California. And I am delighted to be talking to Holly Coulis today. How are you doing, Holly?
I'm good. Hi,
Good.
everyone.
So Holly is joining us from her studio in Athens, Georgia. And I, of course, am here in sunny Southern California. It's been a lot of fun doing these talks, and I'm really glad that people have been joining us. We've got quite a few people here in the chat today, so that's really exciting. It's fun to share work with people. I think now that people have been making their way in there, I'll just kind of get started here. So again, my name is Philip Martin, and I'm the co-owner of Philip Martin Gallery with Portia Hine, who is my wife. And you might have met her at the gallery or at the fairs. We are delighted to be talking today to Holly Coulis. Holly Coulis is in Athens, Georgia. I am in Los Angeles. It's 9 a.m. here on the left coast. And I am delighted to say that I have worked with Holly longer than any of the artists that I've worked with. We have worked together for quite some time. I won't go into it, but it's been a long time. So Holly, you made a remarkable series of works for Frieze, and we have been having conversations with Katie Cowan. Yesterday was Christy Luck. Tomorrow is Joanne Petit-Ferrer. The work that came together for this Frieze booth is just fantastic in terms of color and texture and different approaches to the art objects. We have painting, we have textiles. It's just a really exciting body of work. And so I'm really excited to talk about the Frieze works. For those of you that have questions, of course, you can go to the Frieze viewing room that's on our website. You can also go to the Frieze Fair itself, and you can always email me. So getting back to it, Holly, tell me about your thoughts on where you are in this new body of work.
Well, I feel like the work is getting more abstract,
Mm-hmm.
which was not initially wasn't something intentional.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started making these still life paintings, I mean, they're still very clearly still life objects, but I never intended to push them into abstraction. It just slowly started to happen. And now when and probably the next body of work too, I'm starting to become even most interested in the abstract elements, how the lines intersect and weave, and the sort of places that open up for color. And sometimes I want to even eradicate all recognizable form, although I'm not in any rush to do that. But there's part of me that wants to see what would happen if they became completely abstracted. I'm not quite there yet. I did see an incredible Bryce Marden show in December. Luckily, I went to to New York in December before the world shut down, and was able to see this Bryce Marden show, and it's really all I can think about since I saw it. And I wasn't thinking like, oh, I need to try to make my work more like his, because that's impossible. But I was very moved by his the linear elements in his work and the playful way he puts paint down. And I'm thinking about that a lot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way that you put paint down is fascinating. And you opened up a few topics there: still life, size, how this move towards abstraction. One can just see from looking at this image the incredible color choices and sophistication and thinking that's in the work. Let's just quickly, since I kind of advanced while you were talking, and I do love this to show people. So here's obviously a picture of you working in your studio. And can you talk a little bit about how you build up the color in your work? We can see this image a little bit later. This painting is called Lemonade and Smoke. It's from 2019, and it was in our show. But you build up layers of color, obviously. So perhaps you could just comment sort of a little bit about that, because we can see two different oranges in this color, of course. You can see many, many actual oranges in this picture. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And this might not be the best example because this is something I started to do recently.
Sure.
But in general, what happens is you can see that sort of pale, I guess, pale green line work that outlines the objects, outlines the picture, outlines the lemonade coming out of the pitcher. That goes on to, in this case, what was a flat orange background. So the whole canvas gets painted and then a flat color, and then the drawing happens. And then you can see in the picture, there's a red area and a very pale area that have been painted in on top of the orange background. And those won't remain. Those are under what will be the final layer. So on top of that will be a different set of colors which are shrunken in, leaving a red outline or a pale white outline.
So as we move into some of these bigger works, I mean, this piece for Frieze is called Floating Large Lemon. It's 50 by 60. So when we're seeing so much color operating in context with one another, it's happening through quite a few layers.
Yes. And yes, all layers. So there's this light.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you know, feel free.
This salmon colored background, and then the red drawing. And then within the red drawing, there's a linear element where where it's another place to play with color. So for this lemon, you see this on the right-hand side, you can see an orange shape. And then within that orange shape, I've painted on top of it a yellow shape. So it's a
what functions as a line was at one time an entire orange shape that now has the yellow painted over it.
Yes, and recently I've started doing something where I do put the line, I do make a line on top of another shape. And I started doing that for a couple reasons. One, if you want the outline to be black and you put black down, it's very hard to cover up. And so sometimes I'll put a light color and then make a black outline, but it's also another place to introduce texture. You know, if I do a flat color, it's generally thinner paint. And if I can put a line on top, it generally gets a little more dry brushy, which I like that.
And are you talking about an area like this? Because here you can really see the scumbling, what I would call scumbling, of paint tool dragging across the surface.
Right. Well, if you look right above that, there's a yellow part of the lemon and a dark purple, I don't know what color that is, like a muted purple, reddish purple. That has gone on top of the yellow, and that you can see, especially in like the lower left section, that's dry brushed.
So let's talk a little bit about moving towards abstraction in some of these works and color. Or perhaps you'd rather start with still life. Which would you rather start with?
I'll go with the color and abstraction.
Sure, for 500.
Is there a specific, did you have something specific in mind or just in general?
Just in general.
Well, when I'm painting them, there are, what interests me is what's, I'm up close to them.
Hmm.
Uh, so what's interesting me is what's happening on a not micro, but less macro level. So what's beside each other, how the paint is going down. And so in a sense, my experience with them is abstract, and maybe all painters would say that.
Hmm.
Um, but but because that interests me, I had an impulse to make that uh, more noticeable for people looking at the whole painting as well.
Hmm.
Less sort of about um, things sitting on a table. I have these elements, and a lot of them are repeated. Like the lemon shape is repeated. The orange shape is not a perfect circle, but it's a circle. It's circle-ish, and so it started to feel very fun to me. Like, as I'm doing drawings, like, well, why? I'm doing drawings on a grid, and why? There's no gravity in the drawing, so why does the orange have to sit on the table? It's very easy to move the orange up, and
Right.
then the orange feels like a celestial object or a sun or magic or a
Mhm.
juggling act. And um, it also became a much more interesting game of geometry for me when that started happening. Like, how can I fit these shapes together? What shapes are created uh, when they overlap? And the painting you're showing now was felt exciting for me because the vessels, the vases have all been sort of straight on. Sometimes I'll show like the above circle as though you're looking down on a bowl, but I've never shown the bottom of the dishes, and that doesn't sound very exciting, but it was very exciting for me to see these still lives sort of as objects floating above, as though they're in some sort of universe of their own.
Well, I think that one of the things that you mentioned when we did the talk for the show at the gallery was how you can follow the logic of certain things, like the feeling of gravity. Like, how is gravity working in these works? Or and then you're pointing out an array of other ways to start to look at a painting like this and see how it changes.
Right, and perspective. I think we talked a bit about perspective too. Like,
Because
if
in a painting like this, obviously you could be looking up at these things. They could be lamps. They could be something that was on a table. There's a kind of real generosity in the process now that we've established the terms of a still life as a kind of basic grounding to the idea. Um, it becomes very clear that you're then to the viewer, that the viewer can share with you in this kind of development towards abstraction. I think that's, or development towards other organizing principles within the work.
yeah, it is a lot about organizing, and that doesn't sound very exciting, but it's sort of I always liken it to when people, because it feels this way to me, and maybe it's boring to repeat myself, but when you have a dinner party and people are lingering and there are objects on the table, and people just start restlessly, or maybe not restlessly, but things start to get rearranged. Someone stacks a bunch of orange peels and
Yeah.
cigarette on top, or I don't smoke, but that just and so this sort of how do maybe it's an OCD thing, I don't know, but how do things fit in a way that feels more powerful or more open or interesting, or how do they go together so that it makes sense? And it's funny, like if you give 8 people or 10 people a puzzle, and everyone is thinking, or say draw this, everyone is thinking, well, obviously everyone's going to draw it this way. you know, you think there's only one way to draw it, and that's the way you're drawing it. And then you look at everyone's and they're all different. But so it is, which is always exciting. But for me, it's a very specific, you know, when things are in the right place.
Yeah, you know.
Then it just gels and it's like, okay, this is how this painting has to be.
Yeah.
This is the order of this universe or this table.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it brings up a few different things. I mean, Christy Luck kind of made this really fun and interesting comment yesterday about she knows the painting is done when everyone kind of can agree to have a different idea of what it means. When everybody thinks something different, she knows that she's finally gotten to that point of generosity that she wants. And I think in your work, again, you have this kind of incredible specificity that feels, as to me as a viewer, that somehow you've stumbled on a party that people have had, like a magical party that people have had, and then you're like, wait a minute, as you kind of arrive on the scene. But you also use these kinds of techniques, like I think about painters like Patrick Caulfield. And again, also, you know, while you've also worked off of the sort of the traditions of painting, Western painting, whether they be landscape and portraiture, but still life being sort of the big third one. I mean, still life is a fascinating painterly tradition because it gets started kind of in the mid 1600s, I believe. And it happens simultaneously in Italy, Spain, and Holland. So hopefully I'm correct on all those. And what's really interesting is if you look at people like Juan Sanchez Cotan or other kinds of painters, was it 1500s? Okay, sorry, live. I don't know my art history. You see that people are really enjoying the form. That still life promotes this kind of enjoyment of what paintings themselves can do, and even in that period, I guess in the 1500s, Juan Sanchez Cotan is really like pushing the picture plane. Anyway, that's an array of reactions. What were you trying to do in this show? Tell us about some of the paintings that we're looking at here. This is 2019 at Philip Morton Gallery.
It was like about 30 years ago. What was I trying to do there? Well, one of the main focuses for me in this show was tabletops, and how the table can function as a different shape, an object within the, you know, it's not just the thing that the objects sit on. And again, why does the table have to be, you know, flat or in perspective? So I started trying to flatten out the tables as though they were, you know, cardboard cutouts that then you would fold into a table or overlap them. Just create different spaces and shapes with those intersecting or flattened out planes for objects to fit into. And the one that you're showing on the right now, so the tables are sort of up, but you can see the sides. So there's this like rudimentary perspective, you know, the one you learn when you make a cube in grade 4 or whatever. But all the objects are sort of, you know, the tables are on top of that lemon and orange. And then the objects on the tables are pulled down by gravity, even though that's not the way gravity would work on those tables.
And you have these great moments where there just seems to be just exactly the right space that just sort of happens to fit there, or the way that these tables overlap to create, say, the diamonds or over here in some of these works.
Right. I love that idea of tables looked at from above, but gravity pulling, you know, now they're on the painting plane. So now gravity is working downward on them, or, you know, I like to dabble in ideas of science. So they're like very rudimentary, but yeah.
Incredibly exciting, really, to look at these works, because as you point out, it's not that long ago that we did this show, but you've really made huge changes in the course of the past year or so, really, because of course, the paintings that we're looking at for Frieze, these kinds of elements where you're starting to have these bigger shapes starting to sort of change the painting itself are really, they've really stepped to the forefront in the last year or so.
That was the painting on the right there was the last painting I made
Mm.
for the show. And I felt strange making the painting and including it because I knew that it was one of those paintings that was leading somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think it still looks like it, it still fits into there. But I knew, you can just sense like, okay, something else might happen. And
Yeah.
it's a thing. Like I say, maybe something else might happen as though I have nothing to do with it, but I kind of don't. It's like
Sure.
create the language, or the language gets created, and then it feeds on itself.
Yeah.
So the number of possibilities open up in a few directions or not,
Yeah.
and you just have to follow along.
Well, that's what I also find really interesting, and I've continually come back to that when people ask, well, how do you find artists that are interesting to you? Like, I feel like what's really exciting to me is to find artists who A, have problems they're never going to solve, so it's just going to keep going, and B, understand their own language, in terms of the terms of the art object that they're making. Like, we could talk about line here, we can talk about shape, we can talk about surface, we can talk about perspective, we can talk about the picture plane. There's a lot of different things, both material and depictively, that are going on in here. You can also, of course, talk about subject matter. I tend to be more of a material content guy, meaning I often think more about paint and stuff because I used to be a painter, but that's just my hang up. But at any rate, then you get to then what's amazing is when someone understands their language, then it's like, can you also be generous enough with yourself and your viewer to allow, when you see, this plan I laid out is not going to work the way that maybe it was going to, and the generosity is to be able to violate your language, so to speak, or allow for changes, or maybe it's that moment from Brazil where the letter comes down into the typewriter, and then all of a sudden, like, it changes the whole plot. It changes the literal language, and then the whole plot of the movie is, the whole plot of the situation is going completely differently. Anyway, then I love that idea that you're saying, that the language feeds on itself.
Well, it's sort of like, if you're a scientist, like there's no end.
Yeah.
There's no answer. You find an answer and then you find another problem.
It is really interesting because I think this is such an interesting time for all of us because we're at home, and I have an 11-year-old, and we've been doing a lot of fun stuff, but I've been relearning 5th grade, which has been awesome. And one of the things that happened was we were working on a science experiment, and his teacher pointed out that at this time when people are always talking about how scientists prove things, they prove this, we prove that. She said, no, scientists don't prove anything. They just simply say, well, was my hypothesis supported or not? And then you refine the experiment to keep working on these things. Is there a parallel? I mean, I'm throwing that at you, but is there a parallel there that you're sort of?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I don't think like there's always room for improvement, right? So I'm trying to make the paintings
So
better.
I think I'm not sure what we're about to see next, but I have a high hope that we're about to see a drawing. These are some new things that we're going to see. A couple of things that I had never seen these drawings before yesterday, and was super excited about them. So this is one of the paintings that was in there, and yes, so we have the drawing for it, and it's really fun to even see these. There's a few little changes that have occurred in some of these.
Oh yeah. There are always that's funny. In this drawing, I was really into making one avocado.
Right, totally. That's really funny.
They always change because it's always just when they get on the canvas. So I often will like put lines down and then wipe them out. But
Yeah.
yeah, it changes when it gets.
And also in this one, there's so much line work in this area. Really, you have an area of dense line work operating within other areas that are more maybe shape driven.
Yeah, I love
This
it.
is an interesting one too, in that this one, when you look at it, reads very, to me, I feel like, okay, this is a table in a space I understand. But then when it became a painting, in a lot of ways, it became one of the most abstract pieces in the show.
Right. Yeah, that one shifted. The other thing that happens in these a lot too is that there are color shifts. So,
Right.
so this painting, um, there were the bottom under the table and to the right was the same color as the top and to the left. And I kept thinking, like, this just isn't right.
This and that.
Yeah, I kept looking at, I mean, it was one of the first paintings I finished, and then it just wasn't working. And finally, maybe like a week before the painting shipped out, I was like, oh, that light part, it's really like a puzzle. Like that
Yeah.
light part, that it needs to look like there's light coming down,
Yeah.
shadow, and that it's like an outside day or time. And so I lightened that top part and shifted the color just a little bit. And then I felt like, okay, now I'm much happier. I'm very happy with it.
It's also really interesting for me looking back at the drawing, because these upper parts are not defined in the way that they are in the final drawing. And for whatever reason, I read these as like, well, as shot glasses. I mean, I have like a tumbler of iced, like gin and tonic or whatever. And so when I read those as glasses, that just throws the whole thing into this complete chaos. So it's interesting to see that drawing. And then, so, we try to keep these to about half an hour. I selfishly want to ask you a couple more questions, so we'll move this along quickly, because I do want to show some sculptures. Klaus Gallery in New York, who we work with Holly, great colleagues. I think Hope are out there in the chat today. We also work with Pamela Jordan with them, and we're going to do a talk with her in the next couple weeks. But you showed sculptures there, so I want to show those sculptures really quick, because those I think were also super exciting. But this was a great painting in our show. One question I wanted to ask you about with a painting like this that I haven't covered is that, with the bowls and the lemons, some of them, like the lemons, like my understanding is that you've said that you've drawn them so many times, you kind of can put them in various places. What about some of the other objects, like the grapes or the hot dogs or the cat?
Well, that's the only time I've ever made grapes. I felt like I wanted to try out some new forms in these paintings, more dense. And the cat forms always change. I feel like I would have to change the cat forms, because cats make so many amazing shapes. The lemon only makes one shape, unless you cut it or whatever. But yeah, the cat forms I'm so interested in.
Yeah. Well, it's a fun, this is also fun because I kind of sort of saw this here in this drawing, as opposed to kind of, we're doing something a little bit different, which I thought was fun. Well, the cat is like such a great way to kind of then have conversations about inhabiting a painting, or having that in there, having that feeling of subject, or, enlivening them in that way.
I feel like I need to say that these drawings I make are so quick. Like, they happen like, I mean, I'm not the world's best drafts person, but
well, I didn't mean to put you on this. I didn't mean to put you on the spot or broadcast them nationally to all of internationally, I guess, actually, we have a lot of people in the chat. I'm sorry, this is today's obsession. I just am totally into them. They're fun and exciting. So this is Klaus Gallery in New York again. This was not a show that I was expecting in terms of the sculptures. I mean, I guess you mentioned them to me, but somehow into the show and was just like, oh my goodness. Do you want to talk a little bit about it? I mean, I learned, for example, just a few months ago that your undergrad is actually in sculpture.
and my graduate school.
Oh my God, yeah. Well, I'm a bad art dealer.
Math sculpture, no, I'm kidding. uh, I made more installation work actually, but I did make some sculptures.
Uh-huh.
I'll give credit to a friend of mine who I went to school with and was back in touch with, and she asked me, "Do you ever miss making sculptures?" And I thought about it, and then I decided I do miss making sculptures, and I had been mulling it over in my mind for about a year, and I have no wood shop, no tools. And then there was a young man in town who was like a cabinet maker. And I thought, oh, wait, this is what artists do. They hire people to help them make things that they can't make. And so I made blueprints for these and had lots of meetings. And he cut them and carved them and then brought them back to me, and I painted them. And it was so exciting.
Yeah.
And they're still paintings. I mean, they're sort of like those double-sided paintings that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people made in the Renaissance or whenever, but I wasn't really thinking about that. I was just thinking about bringing these spaces out of the square of a
Mm-hmm.
picture plane, having them be cut out, and then having stands, and it was really fun. I really enjoyed. I was very nervous. They sat in my studio for a long time, just gessoed, because I really didn't know what would happen when I would paint them, if they would be okay or not. So it was exciting, and I feel like there's lots of room for play there as well, and scale.
Well, I think that's one of the things about still life. It works really well in that regard because it does verge on abstraction, and so people do see this. You think about once you've articulated the picture plane to yourself, as someone like Juan Sanchez Cotan does, this Spanish painter that I love, even though if I can't remember what century he was working in. He's doing everything to tell you the painting is flat. He's using trompe l'oeil to create this stuff. And it is true. Once you know where this plane is, and here we are, obviously interacting through a screen, and Brian Bress, who I work with, is so good with the feeling that this is again a two-dimensional medium that we're talking through, and painting is a two-dimensional medium. But again, like once you've articulated the space coming back this way, whether it's of course with live stuff, it gets you into theater convention and all that stuff, but then you start to be able to articulate that question of what you can do to move forward, and things like trompe l'oeil or anamorphosis. I've been thinking about Hans Holbein's Ambassadors. There's all sorts of interesting ways, and I really like how this person has photographed this. I'm sorry that I don't know the name, but you can really see they've set your eye in this perfect spot. They've located the viewer exactly in this way to look at this piece, where you can see that the way this is breaking, the way these two colors are working, and this green line is just like leaping towards you. That as a reaction.
Yeah, color does crazy things.
No kidding.
It's really fascinating. Philip, someone just asked a question, or maybe they asked it.
And we should go for questions here. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. We're going to wrap up some stuff and give Holly a chance to talk. I think now I've got it together where we can do some questions. Okay, well, you're seeing a question, I'm not seeing it, but please, Holly, what is the question?
Someone just asked if I could talk about scale.
Sure.
And that's something I just take for granted now, that it doesn't really matter if the lemon is much bigger than the teacup. Or but that was one of those I wouldn't call it a discovery really, but one of the things I thought when I was doing all these drawings and starting to play around with tabletops and planes is that, and I was feeling if I start to feel trapped by the work, then I have to change things. And it was one of those moments where I was making things to scale, and started to feel a little trapped, and I kept making drawings, and I I felt like they were all wrong. And then there was this, I remember specifically, there was this one drawing that it was annoying me. And suddenly um, everything was kind of to scale. And then I was like, I'm going to make a really big lemon in it. And then the drawing made sense because I had created this space with the lemon that felt really good and disrupted the sort of the more knowable space of the drawing.
Mm-hmm.
So scale, you know, sometimes it's really fun when things are in relation to each other, but scale can make things, similarly to what you were saying about the color, look like they're further back or closer.
Yeah.
But it can also open up a space, or maybe be a little bit funny, or yeah, disrupt and create room for a different possibility that wouldn't exist if everything was to scale.
Well, you know, there's it's that amazing feeling, as you say. Yeah, the picture. Yeah, there. Yeah, I'm. I think you've said it. Well, I don't know if there's anything more that you'd like to add, Holly, at this point. Any further thoughts?
There are two more questions that popped up that
Well,
maybe I'll
if
just.
you could ask those questions. I'm no tech genius, and so I honestly actually can't see them. So please, please tell us what they are and answer them. That sounds great.
Sure, there are two. Joe
Yep.
asks, who collects your work? Oh, I'm sorry, who collects your? He says, a collector who owns your work. I'm dyslexic a little bit. Asks, which artists, past or present, have influenced you?
Mm.
So many. Let's see. I really love Gary Hume.
Mm. So much so much more interesting, I think, than I initially realized.
Yes, Patrick Caulfield, Manet. I mean, you wouldn't say that really, but I just love Manet, Velasquez, El Greco, Picasso. Oh my gosh, Jane Freilicher. Uh, um, oh my goodness, Joan Mitchell. So many painters. There's like very few painters. Oh, Terry Winters. So many of them. I could list a lot, but those are the ones that are. I have to mention William Scott, and William Nicholson as well.
If it's
British,
okay,
Scottish.
before we go on the next painting, I would like to briefly mention your partner, Ridley Howard, who's a spectacular painter, and also a fun thing to do. Obviously, you should follow us on Instagram, but if you follow Holly and if you follow Ridley, Ridley is always posting amazing painters and amazing. I've seen so many great artists that he's shown, and of course, you guys have this gallery, or well, you'll think Tiff and he have a gallery called Howard's that they're working on, a space in New York. I'm not going to do a good job talking about all that, but there's been so much. It's just been really fun and dynamic to kind of follow that. So, hopefully, I didn't say anything incorrect there.
No, the galleries are separate but side by side.
Yeah.
In Athens, and Tiff used to be in LA and moved to Athens.
Yeah.
Not too long after we did.
Yeah. So I want to give a shout out to them. And then the second question that you mentioned?
Someone has asked, are the prints built up using the same kind of layering process that you do in your paintings? No. I wish they were. I'm not a printmaker, and I think the process, I've only made a few prints, and I'm just sort of starting to figure out the process of printmaking, but it seems like everything is like a stamp that gets stamped on top of each other. And there are parts that are overlapped, maybe like a smoke might be overlapped, but in general everything is sort of drawn out separately, has a color assigned to it, and then gets fit together like a puzzle. I'd like to know more. Maybe in silkscreen you can overlap more. That might be a more forgiving process color-wise.
Another thing too is that we didn't really talk about is your works on paper, which I would just mention are also so good. They're gouache, so I think that's correct. They're gouache, and they're completely, that's a kind of material, an opaque watercolor. And materially, they actually have a really exciting feeling that's totally different than oil on linen. Just in terms of another material exploration of the process. A lot of this, what I called scumbling earlier, that dragging of the brush, you can really see it in the works on paper in this really interesting way. And I feel like it creates a really neat grain there. So.
Yeah, that's been really fun though, because the gouache, of course, is a little thicker and
Yeah.
chalkier. But that is, I do like to drag the paintbrush from time to time.
Well, on that note, Holly, thank you so much for sharing your work with us, for letting us come into your studio there, and just spending some time with us at this moment. Thank you to everyone who came. There's a lot of people in the chat, which is really exciting, and we've been getting people from all over the world, which is really neat. I just want to say that I really enjoyed the community at this time and really enjoyed art right now, really enjoying everything about it. And so, yeah, thanks to everybody. And we're doing Joanne Petit Ferrer tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific, and that's going to be really cool. And please look at our work on the Frieze booth, and we'll talk more with you guys later. So I hope everyone has a good day. Enjoy yourself, Holly. Have a good one.
Stay healthy, everyone. Stay well.